Hi, I'm Peter Rao.
And I'm Mike Doran.
Welcome to Counterbalance.
Welcome back to Counterbalance.
That's true. Yeah, welcome back. We're a welcoming bunch. And this week we welcome really a national security professional par excellence, one of the most thoughtful analysts I've had the pleasure of getting to know, Allison Hooker. She's a senior vice president at American Global Strategies, a consultancy, but is best known for her decades-long work in foreign policy and national security. In particular, her 6 years at the National Security Council, where she led the coordination and implementation of U.S. policy towards the Indo-Pacific region. By training, she's a Korea hand, but she can really talk about the region writ large. And we are thrilled that you've taken the time to join us today.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Let me start with the election year 2024. There are dozens of elections around the world. It's called a super election year by many reporters. And to kick off the election year, we're going to talk not about the Iowa caucuses, but about the election returns in Taiwan. Can you just lay the groundwork, what it means, what happened, and where it's going to go from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, it's the first of, I think I heard the figure 48 elections around the world this year. So a really big year for democracy. And Taiwan's elections were really the beginning of that, a perfect example, because Taiwan is what we call, I guess, the superstar of democracy, one of the best success stories for democracy in East Asia. So the election was on January 13th. You had three candidates, Lai Ching-te, the current vice president under Tsai Ing-wen. He is a DPP candidate, the Democratic Progressive Party there in Taiwan. And Lai was running against Kuo Ming-do, the KMT candidate, Ho Yo-i, who is the mayor of Taipei City, and then also against a TPP candidate, a former physician, and just leading this sort of middle ground party, TPP party called, his name is Ko Wen-je. So Lai was expected to win. You had him running in polls up until the last poll, which they shut down the polling 10 days ahead of the election, just a couple of points ahead of the KMT. Very close race, but Lai was able to pull out a 40.1% win, and it's decided by a plurality. So 40% over the KMT candidate, who came in at, I believe it was 36, and the TPP candidate came in at 26. So a little bit more than a hair, winning by a hair. And I think for many of us, we breathed a sigh of relief that Lai Ching-te was able to pull that off. The one thing that I will note, and I'm sure we're going to get into what Lai's policy, his platform, the campaign he ran on. But one thing to note is that it was a general election that included their legislative branch as well. And the DPP, Lai Ching-te's party, lost the majority. And it's the first time since the early 2000s that the ruling party is running a government that doesn't have a majority. And they call it the LY, the Legislative Yuan. So that's going to be a challenge for him in a lot of different ways, and we can talk about that as well.
Why, as an American, did you breathe a sigh of relief?
Well, I guess I'm jumping right into my personal views straight off the bat. I mean, when you're in government, you work with the leader you have, right? And I know the U.S. government would do that, and if I were in government, I would do the same. But Lai Ching-te has committed to follow Tsai Ing-wen's policies, which are basically to continue to build Taiwan's defenses and its deterrence, to get even closer to the United States and to our allies and partners and Europe, and to kind of hold the line. I don't think Tsai Ing-wen would put it this way, but to hold the line to resist China's aggression and coercion, and all of the tactics it's been deploying that we've been seeing on play, particularly since former Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August of 22.
How do you think they greeted this election in Beijing?
Well, in the lead up to the election, Beijing was pretty clear and vocal about who they never said this is our preferred candidate, but they called a vote for Lai Ching-te a vote for war. And that this was going to be an election that would decide between war and peace, and that a vote for Lai was a dangerous vote. So I think that, you look at other analysts, China experts, Taiwan experts, and people who are watching the situation. And I think the majority of us would say we're going to be in for a bumpy year. Now, we just ahead of the election, we had a visit to Washington by Chinese Communist Party member of the International Department, Liu Jianchao. And I'm familiar with Liu because he used to do the North Korea work 10 years ago for the party, the arm of the Chinese Communist Party that covers that part of the world. And Liu visited the United States to continue the engagement between the U.S. and China that the Biden administration started with the Biden-Xi meeting in Bali, not last year, but the previous fall. And the efforts to improve U.S.-China ties over the past year and a half. But anyway, Liu came to the U.S. to continue that, but his timing is really noteworthy. It was just before the Taiwan elections, and everyone expected that they were having conversations about, let's stay calm, let's have a level approach to the outcome of the elections. So far, I mentioned that in a bit of a ramble. I mentioned that because China has remained calm so far. They've made their statement about what their views are ahead of the election and are playing it cool right now. But I don't think that is going to last through the year.
And Tony Blinken today or yesterday in Davos noted, I think in an interview with an American reporter, might have been CNBC, that the Taiwan issue was raised right off the front in those consultations that Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken had with their Chinese counterparts here in Washington before he traveled to Switzerland. As you understand it, how do the Taiwanese people think about their relationship with the Chinese mainland?
It's complicated. So I think, and I think the results of the election reflect that, the complicated nature of how the Taiwanese people view their relationship with China. On the whole, the Taiwanese people do not want to be overtaken by China. And this is, I think, Lai's win reflects that. But the economic relationship between Taiwan and China is very deep, very integrated, and Taiwan is dependent on China. And quite frankly, because of the semiconductors, which I'm sure that will come up in our conversation, the lion's share of the world's semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. Because of that, China is dependent on Taiwan. So you have this interdependence that Lai has stated he wants to decrease Taiwan's dependence on China economically going forward. But because of that integrated relationship, the economic relationship, it's very complicated. It is similar to the conversation about decoupling and de-risking here. You begin to feel the tension of what that would entail, and so I think that's part of how the Taiwanese people view it. But they don't want a war. They don't want to be overrun by China or taken over like Hong Kong, even peacefully. But they also want to keep the status quo, which means that as it is now, minus some of the aggression and some of the coercion that we've seen an uptick in over the past couple of years, return to a status quo and just get on with their lives. I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Can you help us understand the debate about defense in Taiwan? So a lot of Americans are saying, "Oh, they need to do more to turn themselves into a porcupine, and
right.
they won't do it And I hear a lot of Americans characterizing them, but I don't have a good sense at all of how they would characterize themselves and how they debate among themselves about their situation.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think this is it's an evolving issue. And where we are now is, I think, quite different even from where we were 3 years ago. Where to start? So, in our last couple of years, I was in the Trump administration as senior director for Asia. The last 2 years of the administration, and our China policy and Taiwan policy. Won't go into super detail there, but we were making efforts to work with the Taiwanese to have them think about the kind of weapons that would be helpful to them. Don't go after, let's say, tanks. Tanks aren't going to help you in a fight with China.
Yeah.
Let's think about Stingers and other
things that will repel an amphibious assault.
Correct. So let's think more about what might be actually helpful for you. And we had those conversations. And I think increasingly, very much you have the Taiwan Ministry of Defense and the leadership, Tsai Ing-wen, the leadership, the National Security Council, very much embracing those recommendations and not just recommendations, but understanding that for themselves. It's a slow shift, and some of that slowness actually is on the United States because they have already purchased weapon systems that we cannot deliver yet because of our own issues. We're doing a lot with Ukraine, and we can't catch up in the manufacturing of even what some of what Taiwan has ordered and paid for. So there's another complicated issue, but I do think, and then particularly with Lai Ching-te coming in saying that he wants to increase Taiwan's defensive capability, their deterrence capability, grow the relationship with the United States, and even looking at his campaign platform, he wants to be able to develop an indigenous manufacturing capability, which I think is smart as well. It takes time. Everything takes time. I'm not sure we have all the time that it's going to take, not only to get the weapons we've agreed to provide, that they've paid for, things they want to buy, but for Taiwan to develop that capability. I'm not sure we're going to have the time needed for that. But just to put a period on the sentence and answering your question, yes, there's been a debate internally. We've needed to see conscription, the length of time that you have individuals conscripted in Taiwan lengthened. Tsai Ing-wen did that. Lai has committed to maintain that extension. We've recommended in our engagement with Taiwan, even being out of government, that you increase the civilian awareness and capability of even, self-defense, things like that. So there's a lot that can still that Taiwan government and Taiwan people could do to increase their own defensive capability and deterrence. I think they're on the way. And again, I would just say Lai Ching-te is going to continue that policy, and I think that's a good thing.
There's been a lot of ink spilled over President Biden on 3, perhaps 4 occasions, coming out directly and explicitly saying that the U.S. would defend Taiwan or come to Taiwan's aid in the event of a cross-strait invasion. At the same time, the administration has sought to walk back those comments, at least a few of those times. And I've noted that in virtually every press release or official statement, they continue to emphasize that their Taiwan policy is based on the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, the 6 assurances. To what extent is the Biden administration's China policy a departure from what you all implemented or put in place under the Trump administration? And to what extent is there continuity?
Good question. I think there's been a lot of continuity, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that. in the transition between the Trump and the Biden administration, we had a lot of engagement with the incoming team, and as transitions go, you share all of your policy documents, and we had, I think, a shocking number of policy binders that we handed over, and we were very pleased to see that policy continue with regard to China. It's a bipartisan issue now. It's they're. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but just didn't know how that was going to go. So a lot of continuity. That said, in the months leading up to 2024, following the Xi Biden meeting in late 22, and then you had the balloon incident and everything that happened last year, finally, I think the Biden administration has been able to get back on track within their effort to improve the relationship with China in the lead up to our own election this year. Why is that important? Well, I think no one wants tension, no one wants war with China. And I think they see that as a foreign policy deliverable, if I can say it like that, and that they're going to continue to prioritize that. And then that has a natural tension with their how much support the United States gives to Taiwan, because you have to hold that in balance. The Chinese will, increased support for Taiwan is going to increase tension with Beijing, and you just have to balance that and remain firm. So far, so good. Although we'll see how things go, because again, with lies win, I think we're going to see some backlash from China.
What did that? Go
I was just as a follow up. It does seem to me, though, that given the Biden administration is staffed by many of the same officials who were in the Obama administration, that something transpired in those 4 years of the Trump administration to change the Democratic Party's outlook, or the key national security officials in the party's outlook on China. If we think back to Sunnylands, the President Obama's meeting and the assurances he thought he got, the subsequent attempt to reach out and to push for cooperation across all levels. There's almost a naivete, I would say. The Trump administration emphasized competition, and then I think the Biden team has picked part of that up. And I've heard that in background conversations with Biden officials too. Is that because they were read into new intelligence, or they just saw that their point of view was not working? I mean, for Mike's region, the Middle East, that didn't happen at all. They went right back to the old Iran framework. But on the China, you're suggesting something changed. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think China's behavior, China did that for themselves, actually. You have what we call wolf warrior diplomacy, just for a good Southern word, bullying of, not just the United States, but countries around the world through Belt and Road Initiative, through, and then COVID. I think COVID exposed a part of China's character, if I can use that word with regard to a nation, to a country, China's character that was really disturbing to, everyone in the United States and others around the world. I just think there was a real awakening to what the CCP, really is. As we've talked about before, Peter, China's intentions are very. If you look at the documents that have been translated in recent years, but also during our time in government, China's very clear of its intentions, what it wants to do with the international order, and what it wants to do with regard to, using programs like BRI, which isn't talked about so much anymore, but
Belt and Road Initiative.
Belt and Road Initiative, and just its plans to basically, control lots
supplant the United States.
Well, certainly that. Although they deny that, and Liu Jianchao said that very clearly in his recent visit. But if you look at what they've said over the years, their intentions speak for themselves. And I think, to answer your question concisely, I think that not only the United States and both sides of the aisle, but the world has awakened to that. Let's see if it sticks, because you've seen wolf warrior diplomacy, this sort of bullying practice. You've seen them pull that back a little bit because of the reaction that they've gotten and because of the backlash that they've gotten.
How do you interpret the statement I saw quoted around New Year's? I didn't read the whole speech of Xi Jinping in some kind of New Year's message. He looked forward to 2024 as the year of reunification between Taiwan and China. That seemed pretty bellicose. Is that a misinterpretation?
No. In fact, what he says right after that is, using force if necessary.
I even missed that part.
And this is, he has said it prior to that point. It is a Xi Jinping quote you can see made a few times, and that is their policy.
Should we take him at his word that 2024 will be the year of decision?
I think we should always take a leader like Xi Jinping at his word, and be prepared. You always have to prepare for the worst, and not assume, as happened in the Obama administration, that it's just for their own consumption, and that they don't really mean that they'll just come along.
Yeah.
Might mean something else by it.
That's the Biden administration and the Obama administration's approach to Iran. All the fire and brimstone that comes out of Tehran is just for domestic consumption.
Right. So I think we should. We should expect China to try to make good on its word, and I don't know what prevents that besides just good old-fashioned, peace through strength and deterrence.
Are there any in terms of sending a message of that will deter them? Are there any steps that you would like to see the administration do?
Well,
take?
I think we need to continue to provide. This comes back to the question you asked earlier about how does Taiwan view its own defense and what's that debate like? And I think we should continue to help Taiwan become that porcupine, to be able to defend itself, although it will need help, and deter and do as much as we can to provide that support. That is caveated with a lot of footnotes in my own mind, but I think we should continue to do that, and not only on the military side, but support Taiwan as Taiwan used to have observer status in international organizations in a very acceptable way, and part of China's wolf warrior diplomacy over the past few years was to angle out Taiwan from those organizations, the WHO. I mean, there's a long list of examples that we could talk about, but I think
it just lost another official relationship this week. Taiwan did.
Yes, and there's lots of there are things we could do to support them on that front as well. So whether it's on the defense side or whether it is through in its diplomatic engagement, or sort of rising above official diplomatic engagements as we do because we don't have official relations with Taiwan, looking at like-minded nations. And encouraging support of Taiwan even above those official relationships, and that's probably a whole nother conversation. But I think that's something we could do to help.
Speaking of a whole different conversation, but also given the ominous warnings of war, let's go to the Korean Peninsula, which is an area where you have a lot of expertise. I neglected to mention in your introduction that you worked for a long time as a senior analyst in the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And one of your former colleagues, Robert Carlin, together with a professor of practice at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, a former director of Los Alamos National Laboratory, Siegfried Hecker, have a piece in 38 North that just published. And just to read you a quote from this and get your reaction. They write, "We believe that, like his grandfather in 1950, Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to go to war. We do not know when or how Kim plans to pull the trigger, but the danger is already far beyond the routine warnings in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo about Pyongyang's quote-unquote provocations. In other words, we do not see the war preparation themes in North Korean media appearing since the beginning of last year as typical bluster for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Do you agree with that assessment? And what is your take on North Korea's current saber rattling?
Great question. And Bob Carlin was a mentor to me as I started my career in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He had been seconded at that time to what we called the four-party talks with North Korea. But he and my other boss at the time, John Merrill, from the very beginning were teaching me how to read North Korea, look at the propaganda, try to see beyond the bluster, so to speak.
So anything but a crank here, writing these very dire warnings.
And just for our listeners, you were in the intelligence arm of the State Department.
Correct. Yes, Bureau of Intelligence and Research is inside the State Department. It's its own intelligence agency. There are 16 U.S. intelligence agencies, and INR is one of them. And that's where I started my government career in January of 2001. So, yes, Bob I have enormous respect for Bob. And the propaganda, as anyone who followed the Soviet Union knows, or, even Communist China, looking at what they say and how they say it and who's in the room and all of that is very important. The only thing that I will note before I answer your question is that I think, North Korea's had three leaders. You have Kim Il-sung, you have Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-il died in December of 2011, and Kim Jong-un came to power immediately, a very young man in his 20s, and has worked over the years since then to make the regime his own, while drawing, you can't change the fabric of a regime like that because you risk destabilizing it. So there's a balance that Kim has, I think, tightrope he's walked to balance the old and the new. And the only thing I'll say as a foundation for what I'm going to say is that I think Kim uses the propaganda differently than his father did and than his grandfather did. So full stop. Now, back to what I said about taking Xi Jinping for his word. I think we always have to take these leaders seriously because regime survival is at stake, based on what they're saying. And what I mean by that is if they say something and then don't follow through on it, then that weakens them in the eyes of the people, and you can get an unbalance starting. So I read what Bob Carlin and Sig Hecker, and I've known Sig for a long time as well. He is a brilliant nuclear expert, and I know they've been very concerned. During the Trump administration, they were very concerned. They were encouraged by our engagement with the leadership, with Kim Jong-un, but discouraged by the way all of that happened, and they've been worried about what's coming. So we have to be prepared for Kim to make good on those promises. But to me, what stood out and what Kim has said right now is that he's making South Korea the main foe. And that's very interesting to me because the United States has always been the main enemy. And that makes me curious because I wonder if they're beginning to lay the groundwork, as these regimes do, in their public messaging for their people, that maybe engagement with the United States going forward is possible. And
that's interesting.
Because they have not engaged the Biden administration at all, despite efforts to engage from our side. And they've sort of shut down. We saw that very clearly at the end of the Obama administration as well. And I was at the NSC as the Korea director at the time. in response to some human rights designation that the U.S. made against Kim Jong-un himself personally. They just shut down all communication, and it just feels like that time again. These are very touchy-feely analyst words, but it feels like that. But they may be beginning to lay the groundwork for the possibility of re-engaging maybe a Republican administration in the future, or just seeing, making it possible to re-engage the U.S.
We're back to the Iowa caucuses. Mike?
What was your role when in the government when Donald Trump met with Kim?
Great. Yes, I was at the NSC and the Asia Directorate, and I was the Korea Director, which means at the very beginning of that process. Then they made me a Senior Director for the Korean Peninsula, and regardless of what the title was, I was responsible.
You were the Korea person.
I was the Korea person for the White House.
Did you travel with him?
I did.
So you were there?
I was there.
In the room?
I was in the room in Hanoi. I was there at the DMZ, and in Singapore, I was not in the room, but I was part of for the Kim Trump meeting. But I did all the pre-negotiations in the lead up to each of those meetings. And
so give us some color. That must have been fun.
It was fascinating. And I still, when I talk about Korea, when I talk about these engagements, I always say that I think Hanoi was the most consequential meeting for North Korea itself. And I think when whatever happens in North Korea happens, and we're looking back down the timeline, retrospectively, Hanoi is going to be a massive mile marker. And whatever happens in North Korea going forward. And by that, I mean, if North Korea should change.
For those of us who don't follow it closely, in what way is it going to be a turning point or mile marker?
I think that Kim Jong-un came into that meeting expecting for President Trump to agree to his terms. And I think, never mind that in the 3 weeks of pre-negotiation that we were very clear what it was going to take for that meeting to be a success. Steve Biegun, my former colleague, who was former Deputy Secretary of State and ran the North Korea negotiations, was the head of our delegation, and my counterpart for how we managed those negotiations. But Steve and I were very clear about what was going to be needed for everything to go well for both sides. And it was as though that was either ignored or not communicated. And I think Kim really expected President Trump to cave. That is my very top assessment on the matter. I think he just thought, Donald Trump's going to take the deal.
Could you see Kim during the meeting process that this was not going as planned?
Yes, he was.
And could you see, I imagine, his aide sweating, given that the repercussions for a failure of a summit like that in North Korea is very different than for an American government official? Yeah,
he was shocked. He was visibly shocked. And that could mean a lot of things for a lot of different people, how you define shocked. But he was not expecting that. And that showed, physically, I think, we all felt that. And then, really wanting there to be some positive result, looking for a way to make that happen. But he wasn't ready to do the kind of deal that was going to be needed to make the meeting a success.
Do you think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And then I was going to say, the reason I say it's a mile marker is that North Korea had prepared for a success. And there's so much in that statement, but what I'm trying to convey is that, they had their media there, their version of what, Fox News or CNN would be, and as close to real time as they've ever broadcast anything. They were prepared to broadcast back to the people a success. And what you saw was, these kind of propaganda machines don't turn on a dime.
Right.
It's like the aircraft carrier analogy. It has to slowly shift back to the position that this is the U.S.'s fault. It couldn't be a failure in the beginning. It had to slowly shift back to, okay, yeah, things aren't happening because of the U.S. and it's their fault.
Do you think that he was misled by his own staffers? How do you interpret his expectations, false expectations that he came in with? Were they buttering him up to believe that this was going to be a huge victory?
Can I also add, given that he took power in 2011, and this is years later, he probably had never been in a setting where a demand he makes isn't fulfilled.
Yes, I think that's accurate. I know that's accurate. I assess that's accurate. Let's speak like an analyst. But there are a couple of options for what happened. I have my view of what that was. But the options are either his team was too scared to tell him what we were saying because they were afraid he wouldn't come, or that, he would, pull down the meeting, or, something would happen, and they would get in trouble for not being able to deliver the United States for that amazing moment. So option one, team didn't tell him. Option two, Kim ignored the team when he told them because he didn't believe it, because no one's ever told him no before, and that he was sure that because of the relationship that he had been building with President Trump through letters, et cetera, going back and forth, that he thought he knew Trump better than what staff people were telling him. And that perhaps, just to add to
having
that.
been a staffer, that's a real thing.
Yep.
That
Sure.
they often ignore the staff.
Sure. Or that Kim thought he knew that, the Donald Trump that people, sort of the caricature of, wants to make a deal and wants to make a deal so bad he'll take a bad deal for it, which was not my experience. And the president knew it was a deal he could not take himself. And this is probably running contrary to some of the writing that's out there, but no one told him to walk away from that. He made that decision himself, and he was right. It was a bad deal. And then the third option is that Kim's expectations for what Trump would do had been inflated by perhaps mediators in between, whether that's, there was a lot going on at the time. We had Republic of Korea government that was very engaged with North Korea and had huge goals and dreams of what they might be able to do. Speaking of reunification, or just coexistence, with North Korea.
And they had a direct line to him, and they were building up his expectation of what he could deliver.
That's another option of what could have happened. So there's
where was John Bolton in the mix?
Ambassador Bolton was at the table there, at that Hanoi meeting. I've got a picture on my phone. There are, great pictures out there of President Trump and Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Bolton and Mick Mulvaney and the interpreters, and then the backbench of Matt Pottinger, Steve Biegun, and myself. So that was the mix in the room. But, there have been some statements that different people, told the president what to do, but he made that decision himself.
This is a difficult one, but I have to ask it. How stable do you think North Korea is?
It is a difficult one because we don't see, it's quite opaque, and it's more opaque now than it was pre-COVID. COVID, did a lot of things around the world. That's the understatement of the century. But for North Korea, You had diplomats leaving and aid workers, NGO workers leaving, and they sealed the border. North Korea is sort of known as the hermetically sealed nation, the Hermit Kingdom, and it was hermetically sealed. Like they actually had the foreigners leave and then didn't allow any travel in or out, even by their own people.
And its guiding philosophy, Juche, right, is essentially self-reliance in the extreme autarky in its purest, most undistilled form.
It's self-reliance is the short, exactly what you said. It's the shorthand for it. To sort of create for themselves and not to need to depend on anyone else, and which is how they justify remaining. They justify the poverty. They justify the lack by saying we are the pure Koreans because we're not depending on anyone else. We can't depend on anyone else. Well, in truth, they do depend on the Chinese for some things, and they do depend on the Russians and perhaps the Iranians. But the standard line is that they only wanted to depend on themselves. So stability is something that I worked on a lot in my career, and as I said, it's more difficult now to gauge than ever. And I think that if anything happens internally, it could very well be a huge surprise to all of us. So we used to say that North Korea is it's not fragile, but it's brittle. It's quite rigid, but a big shock or a few shocks could really have a destabilizing impact there. I don't really see that right now, but again, it's hard to say. And I guess I'll end this commentary by saying, for decades, people have wanted North Korea to collapse, and they're just so stubborn. They just aren't. They won't. They're not doing it. But I don't think it's impossible. And as with everything else I've said, we have to be prepared for the worst. And that includes with regard to that.
Of the three leaders, who's your favorite?
Oh.
For whatever reason.
Kim Jong-un for his good looks.
The haircut.
I think they are... they all have their interesting points. I'm being careful. I don't want to say charms. They all have their interesting points. I mean, Kim Jong-il, fascinating. He was in his father's shadow. Very, very risk averse. I can't say to a fault. I mean, he was extremely risk averse. And because the regime stability had a formula, and it was everything that Kim Il-sung did, and he did not deviate from that. But what you see with Kim Jong-un is he's risk embracing, which is how we got to the Kim-Trump summit, and there's something about that gives me a spark of hope, because if you could get him, I still believe that Kim is the main decider. He's, that yes, he has advisors. It's not a consensus-based government so far. And if he made the decision to change the nation, he could do that. And all of this does, I could caveat all of this and use weasel words, but I think we got pretty close to that. And he stared that change in the face and realized it was really too risky. Even though he was risk embracing, that was too risky to take the steps. He didn't want to denuclearize. It was going to be too much. And that's a whole nother podcast. And so he did pull back. And who knows, if we had gone into a second Trump administration, then maybe he would have bounced back. But
how confident do you believe the South Koreans are in the American extended nuclear deterrent?
That's a good question. I think pretty confident. is a good answer. That's a sliding scale because it's difficult to, I think, meet South Korea's expectations for that. And what do I mean by that? And having been, in government and know how we try to manage those, that desire for increased capability and, how you manage that, can be quite difficult. But what I will say is that I'm very pleased with, as if me being pleased matters, but I'm very pleased to see what we've done with South Korea, what the United States has done with South Korea over the past couple of years. And yes, that's Biden administration focus on alliances, but it's also Yoon Suk-yeol. Yeah. President Yoon has taken South Korea in a direction that it should be going. In my personal view, he's elevated South Korea's place on the world stage. He has a vision for Korea that I think is wholly appropriate and needed. And I'm encouraged by that. And no matter what happens this year with the elections, I think that'll continue.
Why? I want to switch gears entirely and ask you a technical question. Why can't the Chinese replace the Taiwanese as the semiconductor producer of the world?
Well, there is, as I understand it, and I'm not a extremely gifted technical person, but as I understand it, there is some, the highly advanced semiconductors, of which Taiwan provides 90% of the world's supply. They manufacture 90% of the world's supply. The Chinese haven't been able to crack that code. There is a layer of expertise and capacity that the Chinese have not been able to break into. And we
can't do it either, right? Can we do it?
Can we do it? I think we can.
The way I explained to me is it's like baking. You can't just look at the ingredients and it takes.
It's art as much as science.
There's an art to it, but the art also requires teams who are highly experienced, will stick together, will work odd hours.
The manpower and the sort of commitment, devotion to one's job that's needed, is we don't have the capacity needed to scale up here.
But couldn't the Chinese do that? You would think that they would want this more than anything. And
from what I understand, they cannot achieve that last layer of making it work. I'm being super technical here. The last few ingredients, they haven't been able to bake it and make it work right. And which is why, the debate over what happens with, the golden egg, the TSMC, should there be a conflict with China, that's on a lot of people's minds.
Didi, I think we'll thank Allison for taking us to the hazardous waters of the Taiwan Straits and not to the Korean Peninsula. And thanks for coming on Counterbalance.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.